Thank you for listening to this PYA webinar recast. PYA is pleased to offer this alternative way to access our thought leadership. This is a recording of a previously delivered webinar. The information is accurate as of the date of the original event. The video recording, slides, and associated material for this and all PYA webinars are available on our website at pyapc.com. This podcast is for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be used as legal advice or an official opinion.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to PYA's Summer CPE Symposium, Hot Topics in Healthcare, Day 1. Our second presentation of the day is Third-Party Risk Management, presented by Lori Foley. With that, I'll hand it over to our presenter.
Perfect. Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to have all this great technology for our teams and our attendees to listen to and use today to make it a customizable experience. So I'm excited to join you for this second session as we are talking about third-party risk management. I hope the session this morning was helpful for you as you talked about all of the information that's going on in DC and the impacts it has in our healthcare space. And I know the sessions tomorrow will be equally impactful. As we go through today, please, as Jennifer said, feel free to submit those comments through the chat pane, and we will get those answered either through our conversation today or via follow-up email. By way of introduction, I'm Lori Foley. I lead PYA's Revenue and Compliance Advisory Service line and have done so since 2016. Obviously, everything we do in healthcare touches compliance in some manner, and you'll see heavy veins of compliance running through our conversation topics today, regardless of what role you play within the organization. Third-party risk management, as you will see, it just touches everyone's job in our environment. And so we want to arm you with some talking points and some perspectives as you evaluate risk within your organization and those areas with which you can be impactful or ensure that others in the organization are being impactful. So at the end of the day, that you have the opportunity to continue to influence providing patient care and not getting distracted by some of the areas and risk that occur from third-party utilization. So with that, we're going to dive right in and take a look at the big picture. Obviously, the healthcare industry is no stranger to third-party data breaches, supply disruptions, COVID, anyone, if that's a recollection for you and your organization, and increased scrutiny surrounding access to and disclosure of protected health information, or PHI. So in our experience at PYA, when we ask our clients the top risks that keep them up at night, making up the top 3 seems to be cybersecurity and breaches. Really, that's 2. Those are the two high areas that focus on that are keeping our colleagues up at night. Keep in mind that this enhanced emphasis on data security is coming on the heels of COVID. Even though we're 5 years away, we're still seeing some of the trailing and lagging effects, but we all experience those significant supply chain shortages, such as ventilators, protective equipment. And it also exposed vulnerabilities, both in our operations and in our ability to provide care to patients when we rely on third parties. Third-party risk management really extends beyond traditional procurement vendor assessments. It really encompasses, in our opinion, a holistic approach that integrates governance and risk management and compliance all together. Those are the acronym GRC that you'll see if you look at a lot of information related to third-party risk management. And that's across the entire life cycle of third-party relationships. It spans onboarding, ongoing monitoring, and offboarding. So those key cycles, the key phases of the cycle related to third-party risk management. So we'll dive into those a little bit deeper as we get going. Why is this escalating? During the economic uncertainty right now, we're seeing more organizations that are pushing more business out to third parties, as much for cost reduction as to maintain status operations in certain areas. The price of healthcare data is rising in the open market and the dark web. And if you're attending tomorrow's session with Barry Mathis, you always get some really good and scary stories related to that. So I encourage you to attend. We won't dive into those deeply here. We're going to look at it more from an umbrella approach. But many organizations just don't have the internal resources to fully address these areas of risk. And so they utilize these areas of supply and services rather. And so they use trusted partners to help certify, host, maintain, support health IT systems, and sometimes those modern cybersecurity systems. As third parties become more and more involved, then we see additional government scrutiny. So from organizations such as the Department of Justice, and really we see updated HIPAA rules and information come out that is, just overlaying on how we all operate within the healthcare space. And so those focuses on cybersecurity, ransomware, supply chain shortage are all super important. And then of course we can't forget the reputational risk that our organizations may experience related to some of these. So our goals today on the right, our learning objectives, are really to dig into the importance of TPRM, third-party risk management. I'll use those terms interchangeably as we talk today, specifically as they relate to healthcare. TPRM is industry agnostic. All industries are or should be evaluating their third-party risk management, but obviously we're focusing today in the healthcare space. We'll review some recent incidents and regulatory focus areas that should be on the radar, defining those categories and types of third parties just so we have a comprehensive list that we're working from, identifying compliance and regulatory requirements pertaining to those third-party vendors, exploring some core elements of a TPRM program. If you have one, to make sure you've got all the boxes checked. If you don't have one or are considering the expansion of one, so you have that perspective, understanding the coordination of those internal stakeholders, and then reviewing some recommendations related to appropriate oversight, board level reporting, and escalation processes. If we have some extra time, there's some extra content that we'll address as well. So I really want you to come away with a good understanding of what a third-party risk management program looks like, the key components there, and how to bump up and evaluate yours as you go. As I mentioned, this is not cybersecurity 101 or even HIPAA security 101. We're talking more broadly about the importance of, to assess and mitigate risks when we're relying on those third parties throughout our organization. Really want to make sure you have the ability to take this back and evaluate your environment in this context as you're moving forward and using this information. We've found over the years really that fragmented and siloed approaches to TPRM can lead to operational gaps, and that might expose you to compliance failures, reputational damages, and financial loss. And then to address those challenges, that's where we really push for that mature TPRM program, using that strategy and a structured framework to integrate risk intelligence and regulatory insights into that daily decision making throughout the organization. So as we look at the variety of areas that are impacting us in the third-party breaches in healthcare, obviously healthcare has become a highly targeted environment. When you think about the data breaches, that has accounted for over 41% of the reported incidents in 2024 alone. Those are not only increasing in frequency, but also in severity, which creates massive data exposure, service disruptions, and regulatory scrutiny. And the reliance of interconnected vendor ecosystems. Think about right now as you're sitting here, how connected are you to a third party? Thinking about your Apple Watch or your Fitbit, your phone, your Alexa or your thermostats within your office's cars for many of us. The list really does go on. And now think about what happens if you have relied on that third party to pay your bills, buy your groceries, those types of things, and then suddenly you have a compromised situation. How would you operate your daily life and within your professional environment? How do you carry on your operations within your professional environment? And so we're seeing those vulnerabilities create risk for the organization that, again, impedes your ability to do your day job, but also trickles down to the ability of your organization to effectively care for patients at the bedside. So when we look at, if I had a virtual show of hands, I know most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with or have even lived through some of these significant events that occurred in 2024. For example, the Change Healthcare scenario in early 2024 where it affected over 100 million individuals. It was a result of an exploitation of network vulnerabilities by a ransomware group, and the consequence was about $3.1 billion with a B in response costs and a $22 million ransom payment. Not to mention all the trickle-down effects that our providers felt at all levels related to interrupted cash flow, the inability to file claims, get remittances and payments back in a timely manner. There was also the Health EC platform that affected 17 healthcare organizations related to a single vulnerability in a pop health platform. Again, everybody's trying to do the right thing. They're managing the patient's health and expanding care, and identified a vulnerability, was able to find its way through and created a widespread data exposure and operational disruption for those organizations. Similarly, Kaiser Permanente experienced a situation and an impact that affected 13.4 million individuals. A misconfiguration of the system led to inadvertent data sharing with third-party advertisers, and again had a widespread impact, potential HIPAA violations, and obviously some potential reputational fallout from that organization. If nothing else, they were in the news for reasons other than what they would like to be there for. So these are just some examples that we saw that were significant in 2024, with 47%, according to a recent survey, 47% of healthcare respondents reported severing relationships with third parties, and 49% suffered regulatory fines associated with these types of incidences. Loss of customers, business disruption, reduced revenue, or just common outcomes as well that were reported through those surveys. And really, the report showed that confidence in the sector's ability to reduce those disruptions varies. And so that's why it's important for us as executives within the organization to really focus on these areas and do what we can to help mitigate that as we go through. Healthcare organizations have long time struggled with third-party risk management. We'll talk about what that looks like in just a moment. But as we rely on a wide variety of vendors that have varying access to sensitive data depending on the scope of the services that they're providing for your organization and the number of individuals who are managing the relationships with the third-party vendors, it really creates a complex vendor ecosystem that, combined with the huge amounts of sensitive data, make healthcare, a top target. So looking here is just identifying examples of third-party vendors. So thinking about those that come top of mind related to medical device manufacturers, cloud service providers, third-party administrators, billing, coding, consulting, marketing and website services, EHR, and all the bolt-on and add-on services that go tangential to that. We've mentioned the population health platform in the prior example, telehealth platforms, data analytics, supply chain vendors. All of these areas are examples of third-party vendors. I'm sure you've identified others within your organization. I invite you to drop them into the chat for our audience as you're thinking through those areas, just so everyone is thinking as comprehensively and broadly as possible. So Jennifer, it looks like we have our first polling question, so I will let you pop in.
Thank you. The first question is, types of third-party vendors include medical device manufacturers, billing companies, website developers, consultants, or all of the above. Remember, you must fill out the polling questions to receive CPE credit.
So we're getting a little bit of a mixed bag.
All right, thank you for participating in our poll. Now I'll hand it back over to Lori.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, the answer is all of the above. Third-party vendors are really anyone outside of your organization who is interacting with your organization through devices, equipment, information, services, all of those pieces. So medical device manufacturers, billing companies, website developers, and consultants can all be considered third-party vendors that need to be on your radar and managed so that you are mitigating risk through the organization. So looking at, for purposes of our discussion today, we'll look at these 5 elements of the TPRM lifecycle. Noting that sometimes the middle 3 are collapsed into one, I'll call it a monitoring lifecycle category. So always we're starting the lifecycle with beginning the relationship, the onboarding section, onboarding process, where we are initiating the relationship with the vendor, including any due diligence and contract setup. Once a vendor, we'll dive deeper into these, but once we have a vendor onboarded and services are being provided, we can't just lock and load and let it carry on without oversight. So ensuring that there are activities focusing on that monitoring section, including risk assessment, evaluating risks such as compliance and financial and operational, and those kind of blend as much to onboarding as they do to starting into the provision of services. Monitoring, making sure that the vendor's performing appropriately, that we're being aware of any risk indicators, and evaluating that performance, whether it's the ongoing service provision or if there are specific deliverables that are being considered or planned on as a result of that contract, making sure that that's happening as planned. And then offboarding. At some point, relationships may come to an end, and how you exit that relationship has implications from a risk perspective. Do we need to shut down? Do we need to get sign-offs and signatures? Do we make sure we have deliverables? Do we need to terminate access to key systems such as electronic health records and documents such as that? So what that process looks like, it's just as important on how you close out a relationship as it is how you initiate that relationship on the front end. So really the first step to gain better visibility into who the company is doing business with, and that sounds simple but can be quite complex depending on your organization. Really having a good, strong inventory and developing onboarding processes and considerations are important. A thorough approach typically includes a framework and defined processes for assessing that third-party risk, such as a questionnaire that may go out to third parties, and a means to score the potential risks based on their responses, because not everybody's going to get the same level of response depending on the services that you are engaging with or purchasing, and then also based on the role that that individual will be working for with you. So as you're looking to develop and maintain a centralized inventory of all third-party relationships, such a key area to identify who's going to be the keeper of the list, how are we going to feed information to that individual for the list, how are we going to update it and keep it current, because it will become dated, within 30 minutes of the day that of the moment you have it completed. And it can include key information about all of the different relationships, what all they have access to, where you have those vulnerabilities, and classifying those vendors by risk tier. Usually we see a critical relationship, high risk, medium, and low. And then evaluating for those that are high, how far do we need to go in order to get comfortable with how we are engaging with that vendor. And sometimes that elevates to what we call a SOC 2 or a high trust audit, really where we're digging into all of the processes and their controls to help mitigate risk, to ensure that we're mitigating our own risk by onboarding them. So here we have a sample vendor tier determination flow chart, and it's a little bit small on screen, so definitely you can access it through your slides. We're happy to share it in a separate document if it's helpful for you, but really looking to make sure that your vendor determination flow chart includes some key information. So for example, an inventory of all of those vendors, including the name, the coverage type, what department is responsible for that relationship, who are the key individuals that are managing both contractual terms and then service delivery, and what are the payment terms, what are the contract terms, when does it start, when does it end, does it auto renew, and then identifying if the vendor has access, what are they accessing within your system. Do they have access to PHI, or are they providing services without that? And each of those questions will help walk you through the various categorization so that you can get them to a tier 1, a tier 2, or a tier 3 that's based on risk. And then your response to each of those categories will vary based on your assessment of both your operating environment, your exposure to risk, how critical these relationships are to your ability to do your business on a daily basis, and then the steps that need to be taken as you work through to address and mitigate that risk. So happy to make that available as helpful, but definitely refer you to the slides for a little bit closer review as you go through to get to the scoring, if you will, of those vendors. In addition to these considerations for due diligence, and you see, we're saying do your homework, you really got to evaluate those vendors as you are onboarding. Most organizations, when they can, will get multiple quotes and they'll talk to different parties to get a good sense for the experience and the professionalism, all of the components. How many boxes do they check for you and your particular needs? But then also thinking more broadly related to areas such as those risks identified on the right side of this slide. Have they had data privacy breaches? How did they respond to those? What is their level of security related to that? Have they been parties to regulatory non-compliance or settlements, such as corporate integrity agreements or civil investigative demands that you're learning through as you interview the individuals or the organization and their approach to those? Cybersecurity incidents, do they have any security ratings? What about conflicts of interest? How do you evaluate if they have relationships with parties that are inherent in your environment and your system, for which you need to know about those relationships? There's a lot of analysis that goes into a conflict of interest, but sometimes it's just dealing with a perceived conflict. It may not be a technical conflict, but still understanding what that looks like. Compliance program maturity, both yours in your ability to manage these risks and evaluate them and keep your arms wrapped around it, but do they have a compliance program, and how did they attest and do activities within their organization that ultimately help keep your organization more secure? Financial and operational stability, obviously there's importance in that, particularly if they're a critical vendor for your operations. You need to know that they are secure and that you don't have to worry about them shutting their doors in short order and you being left without a resource that would impede your operations. And then are they aware of their obligation to check for excluded providers, recalling that on the excluded provider list there are more than just clinical providers. And so as a business organization, as key executives, are their staff, any of those individuals excluded because your conditions of participation with Medicare and you're filing claims to Medicare and Medicaid? By submitting a claim, you are attesting that you are not contracted with individuals who are excluded. So you need to have your own processes to make sure of that, but they also, as a vendor, need to be asserting that for you as well. In addition to these considerations for due diligence, examples of automated ongoing and auditing and monitoring are also a tool that you can use. Examples of that include real-time third-party risk intelligence that makes proactive supplier and vendor monitoring possible, meaning you can load in all of the vendors that you use and the software will query the websites and come back with a list if there are any instances where those vendors are popping on certain checklists. Organizations can use these external data providers to receive those updates on a continuous basis to assess financial health, cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and reputational concerns. And then by integrating those into your operations, you can make informed decisions based on comprehensive risk scoring and predictive analytics rather than just relying on a periodic manual process. So the tools are not for everybody, depending on the size of the organization and the number of third-party vendors that you're navigating, but it is a tool that would help some health systems evaluate and really maximize those processes. We really see technology shifting in TPRM from a reactive compliance-focused exercise to a more proactive, intelligence-driven exercise and discipline. And so we're seeing organizations start to deploy artificial intelligence and that automation, those real-time data analytics, to really help develop a strategic advantage in mitigating that third-party risk and while ensuring the operational resiliency and that regulatory alignment. So again, just those key areas where evaluating the different components to make sure you've got your arms wrapped fully around it. We are seeing continued use of offshoring, and by that we are referring to the utilization of human or technology resources that are located outside of the United States, districts and territories of the United States. And really the U.S. judicial system has limited authority to enforce violations, so it's important to understand what all is being offshored, who's doing it, what are some key risks that you need to be mitigating. So commonly offshored services that we see include audit, both internal and external audit, billing and coding, billing payment and posting, a lot of times call center support, data storage and hosting, utilization review, utilization management, some care management activities, as far as where there is a supporting role, not roles that are able to be billed to Medicare, for example, but some back office supporting roles, and then transcription or services that we see often offshored with our health system clients, and really thinking through those risks that offshoring brings. There are some technical risks, there are physical security risks like clean room standards if you're beholden to those. Sometimes there's language barrier or interpretation differences that you might have to navigate. Management of the offshore services to ensure that you're getting service that is consistent with what you would otherwise be offering within your organization. And then again, some restrictions based on federal and state law. And I feel like a lot of folks are aware of the Medicare prohibitions, but we do see clients that are not necessarily as familiar with state prohibitions, specifically through participation in the Medicaid program related to use of some of these. So I'll call that to your attention while we're discussing. Additional risks that we see are just being aware of making sure we don't have any HIPAA violations, any data breaches, data integrity and cybersecurity. That theme continues to run through and weigh heavily, but there are also then regulatory compliance areas to keep in mind. Again, HIPAA compliance, international regulations, and then when we look at quality and service, really making sure that you've got the resources, how they're meeting your level of expectation related to quality services and delivery. Sometimes there are some hidden costs associated with the offshoring, loss of control, and then in some areas, depending on where that offshore staff are working, whether or not there's some political instability, and is there risk for your organization if they are experiencing that instability that you lose a section of your workforce that you're relying on for your daily operations. So Jennifer, back to you for polling question number 2.
All right. The second question is, the definition of offshoring is my next vacation, services utilized inside my facility, utilization of human or technology resources that are located outside the United States, districts, and territories of the U.S., production of goods or services within the U.S., or relocation of a production facility to the U.S. Remember, you must fill out the polling questions to receive CPE credit. All right, thank you for participating in our poll. Now back to Lori.
Thank you, Jennifer. All right, I'm playing with the buttons. I'm pushing that result, so hopefully you can see the majority of you identified option 3, utilization of human or technology resources that are located outside the U.S., districts and territories of the U.S., and that is accurate. So really understanding that component for your organization is helpful. So now let's turn to coordination of internal stakeholders, turning to the middle gap. We did diligence on our vendors and tiered, classified them, figured out what kind of background we want to do. Now really looking at including, what's that monitoring piece look like in the middle of our life cycle? So we've onboarded them, we're off and running. And really, it's important to make sure that you have engaged your internal stakeholders in that monitoring and performance evaluation. So what does that look like? We're talking about establishing a cross-functional committee. Usually we see the makeup of that committee to include individuals from internal audit, compliance, legal, quality, risk management, supply chain, billing and service line leaders. depending on the outsourcing of the service, whoever's responsible at the front line for interacting with those vendors and the services they're providing, but also those that help us perhaps more in an internal environment, kind of manage our processes around those third party, which is where legal comes in, internal audit and compliance. And remember, we said a lot of times this used to be just really a compliance function, but it is broader than just the compliance team. It should be a part of, it should be on the radar of a number of individuals because of the different roles that they play. Second, we would really want to define the roles and responsibility across departments. That includes identifying subject matter experts or SMEs who will be involved in the diligence and the ongoing monitoring of the vendor against those contractual requirements. Why is that? We've got the agreement, we know what all the terms are, but how the vendors perform some of their responsibilities could be highly technical. And so that's where you need those subject matter experts to say, yes, they are meeting, they're doing what we need them to do. They're meeting the terms of the agreement related to the technical components, the provision of service technical components, and then others on the committee from legal, internal audit, and compliance can also weigh in on they're meeting the rest of the contract terms. And sometimes in an organization, the front line may not know the rest of the contract terms. So really understanding how we're communicating all of the items that the vendor is committed to and that we're holding them accountable for, how we articulated what that is, who's responsible for monitoring each of those components, how are we going to aggregate and share that information to make sure the organization's getting what they are expecting and paying for while also mitigating those risk areas that we talked about earlier. And then really using tools such as dashboards for transparency and accountability, remembering that due diligence is not a one-time event. It's not just part of the onboarding process. It really has to live and breathe throughout the life cycle of the relationship. So really focusing too on those high risk and critical vendors at least annually, and depending on the services that they provide or how you ranked them in the tiering on the front end, you may need to do that more frequently. It could be quarterly or every 6 months, whatever the appropriate time frame is, to make sure, depending on how often things are changing, that you need to evaluate to make sure those changes are known and in accordance with your expectations. And really, this is where we find a lot of times it's difficult. It's where do we store that information? Is it on a shared drive? Are we going to buy a platform to manage that? And that could be related to those vendor contracts. It could be related to business associate agreements, any of those, all of those things that kind of come together to make up that whole contractual package is important to keep in an organized manner, where in one place, ideally where multiple people have access and or are monitoring that process as we go through. And really just, again, it's not static. So thinking through and developing that continuous risk assessment mindset. So who is in charge of monitoring regulatory updates, such as the HIPAA privacy and security rule? Your organization may have a dedicated individual who is responsible for that, but you may not, or you may have an individual who wears many hats. And how do we know that they're getting that lens and they're looking at that area in consideration of their other duties and responsibilities? So making sure that that's happening and that we're carrying that information back to update and align with our TPRM policies. Who all are participating? How are we monitoring the ability to keep up with those more global threats? And that could be through your hospital association. There's the American Hospital Association has a health information sharing and analysis center. Many of you, I'm sure, have periodicals and things that you do, pushes from email listservs and such to kind of keep your finger on the pulse. How are we taking what you're seeing in those headlines and those articles you're reading to get it to a work plan or something that the team is monitoring? And then making sure if there is an incident that you are evaluating, ways to update your risk models and your controls to ensure that doesn't happen again, that we continue to learn from that particular event and circumstance. Obviously, when we have committees, we have to have governance oversights, and there are a number of areas where this needs to occur and live and breathe. It's not just the line individuals that are interacting with the vendors. It's not just the committee. the TPRM committee, it is important that the organization has governance and leadership buy-in. And so ensuring that we're providing those regular updates to executive leadership and the board as appropriate, identifying and aligning metrics with the enterprise risk appetite, and those are in the key areas of financial, operational, compliance, and reputational risk. And then making sure we're doing annual reviews of the TPRM framework and updating policies as needed. Desktop exercises is a heavy IT term, but it really still relates even to assessment of risk through these areas that we're looking at through TPRM. When we're thinking about, it really is back to establishing that framework, defining those roles and responsibilities, and then implementing the mechanisms that allow you to monitor and review that relationship throughout that life cycle. When we're thinking about the key areas and the key elements, in addition to those summarized here on the slide, I'm also thinking about things like the governance framework. What is our structured approach? Do we have policies and procedures and reporting lines? What do they need to look like for your organization? And it may look different for a smaller organization than it will for a multi-hospital health system, for example. What types of risk assessment tools are we doing? What types of due diligence? How do the contractual agreements look? Are we establishing clear and enforceable contracts that outline expectations, responsibilities, and remedies for breaches? I know of organizations that have a very robust legal team, and then we might be assisting with evaluating how a vendor's carrying out their duties, and you go back to the agreement, you're like, gosh, the terms of this agreement are so different than the normal documentation processes and the sign-offs we see in contracts. How did this one get by and be, sloppy, for lack of a better word, but in a scenario where it really exposes the practice in the hospital or the provider to significant risk? There is an opportunity to do independent reviews for TPRM as well. Many organizations conduct independent, obviously you have your external financial audits, you have your internal audit team, your regulatory compliance team that may be doing audits. Sometimes having those as conducted by a third party helps everybody make sure that we're not missing something because you're too close to it. And TPRM is another area where we would encourage you to include that on that list of review areas when you're doing that. When we're looking at that accountability, it really is assigning that responsibility, but you can't assign accountability without also providing training and communication. So how are you communicating to your stakeholders, be it the individuals who are getting the bids and reviewing contracts, those frontline employees who are interacting with the vendors, to understand their role in risk mitigation? So for example, we have a vendor, we're having a challenge with the vendor. They're not getting what they need. They're not getting the responsive that they need. The work is not of the quality as expected. Are they bringing that to someone's attention so it can be evaluated? Is it a one-off situation, or has there been a change with the vendor that you need to know about? Sometimes that could go on for 3 months or 6 months or whatever. And if somebody had spoken up sooner, then we could have mitigated it and not made payments for services that weren't meeting the industry's needs or the organizational needs as we go through. So a number of these areas are hopefully not new for you as you are looking at evaluating that governance and oversight, but just some areas that come to mind when we look at how that might become living and breathing within your organization. As we mentioned, there is that increased government scrutiny. The Department of Justice issued an evaluation of corporate compliance programs in March of 2023. It outlines specific expectations related to managing third parties, including risk-based and integrated processes, making sure that these are integrated within the organization's procurement and vendor management processes, that there are appropriate controls, that is there a business rationale for the organization to be using the vendor in the first place? What are the contract terms? Do they explicitly outline the services that are to be performed? And do they manage or set the expectations of what successful provision of services look like? What are the milestones? What are the deliverables? What should we expect? What type of communication should we expect? What if the organization is doing audits, for example, if it's an outsourced auditing or coding firm that might be providing support, what are they doing internal to their organization where they're doing their own auditing and monitoring? How are they reporting that back to you to make sure that you know that they're doing their own quality assurance, quality control within their organization that you can then leverage and rely upon within yours? Making sure we have that management of relationships. Do we monitor the performance? Does it have audit rights in the contract? Are you utilizing those audit rights? Again, making sure that you're getting what you're paying for. And then are there actions and consequences, including mitigation, that we're addressing? If you identify risks or concerns during due diligence and you proceed with engaging that third-party vendor, what are you doing to make sure when they're providing services for you that you've addressed that risk and it isn't perpetuating itself going forward? So as with all audits, if you've identified a finding or a problem, what are you doing to mitigate that, documenting it, and then kind of recalibrating as you go forward to mitigate that risk? So the DOJ was very clear. If there are issues, they're going to come to organizations and ask for these programs, and they're going to look to make sure that they're robust, that they're thorough, that they're living and breathing by the individuals within the organization. They're not just policies put up on a shelf to check a box. And so having this will help mitigate some of the, or hopefully mitigate some of the findings or repercussions or fines that could come with it. So encourage you to keep that in mind as you're developing your program. Jennifer, back to you.
All right, our third question is, appropriate oversight for TPRM includes periodic audits to assess the effectiveness of TPRM, providing training and communication to ensure that personnel understand their roles and responsibilities, integrating TPRM with the organization's ERM efforts, continuous learning and assessment of risks, including regular meetings and reports to review third-party risk, or all of the above. Remember, you must fill out the polling questions to receive CPE credit. Thank you for participating in our poll. Now I'll hand it back over to Lori.
Perfect. I'm hitting the button that says push results to audience. Hopefully everybody can see that. It pops back, so I don't know how long it lasts, but we had 99% of you identify that all of the above, which is correct. All of these are different components of appropriate oversight for TPRM, and really just making sure periodic audits that we're training and communicating to make sure that all of the individuals understand they have a role, that we're integrating it. We didn't touch much on the enterprise risk management, but TPRM is a part of ERM. And then that continuous learning, assessing risks, updating, all of those things based on your environment and what you're learning as you go through those areas. So we mentioned the importance of including leadership buy-in. So that's really management leadership, but also can elevate up to the board. So this slide provides a list of questions that board members and or committee members should be asking regarding our third-party risk management activities. How would you answer those? So for example, has a multidisciplinary committee been created? Who all is involved? Do we have the right players? Do we need to expand or contract that? And its composition can change as the organization grows or contracts. What's the business rationale for the use of the third parties? Does it make sense? Is there a good solid business reason that we're doing it? How are they selected, and how are we evaluating conflicts of interest? How are they audited and monitored, and by whom? Who's responsible for that? Has the organization considered and analyzed compensation structures for third parties compared to compliance risks? So do you need a fair market value opinion for that relationship, for example? And how are those due diligence red flags addressed? So a variety of things that should be on the radar for executive leadership and board members as we are evaluating the TPRMs. Shifting gears just a smidge, if you are establishing or thinking about establishing a third-party risk management structure, there are several ways that this can be established to best fit the needs of your organization. Generally, as with many other services within a health system, there are 3 different structures that are typically utilized. a centralized structure, a decentralized structure, and then a hybrid. A centralized structure and approach is useful in a smaller environment where there's close proximity between frontline and the individuals who are often managing these processes from a contract procurement perspective or contract management piece. A decentralized process, so every department's doing their own thing or each facility is doing its own thing. A decentralized environment can create some of the usual challenges that you would otherwise see. For example, you might have duplication of effort, lack of transparency across the organization as to who's doing what with which vendors, and then a lack of a consistent application of policy. So I would say most well-functioning TPRM structures center around a hybrid model where the third-party risk management team has assigned responsibilities, but the departments interacting with the vendors also have key defined roles, including subject matter expertise to effectively manage the work of the vendor, line of sight into whether the vendor is appropriately carrying out their duties and managing those day-to-day tasks. And then the central office is usually, in that scenario, responsible for ensuring that the agreements have been through the appropriate review structures, that they're cataloged and stored somewhere, that key terms are identified and ultimately managed too. If you already have a third-party risk management structure, there are several best practices that I just want to call to your attention today, where you can help evaluate your program and evaluate whether or not there are some changes that need to occur. So for the first one, ensuring that your TPRM program has a process developed that follows the third-party risk management lifecycle that we talked about. So the onboarding, including the due diligence, the middle cycle, including monitoring and maintenance, and then offboarding as those relationships come to a close. This allows you to really ensure that your organization is assessing and managing risk appropriately throughout all of your vendor relationships. Second, does your organization have defined policies and procedures? And are they reviewed and are they updated at least annually? More frequently if your environment is in flux. And so making sure that you have a prompt response to regulatory changes, operational changes, and market changes. All three of those could impact how you are approaching your TPRM processes in your management in that area. Third would be maintaining a current log of issues that have been identified through your centralized and frontline team members. So that should include the vendor, include details regarding the issue. If there's a remediation plan, what is that plan? Are there effective dates? Who's monitoring it? Who's signing off that either everything is remediated appropriately or we have continued issues? This log really allows the organization to keep open issues front and center and make sure they get addressed, that they don't fall off just because people get busy and go back to what they were doing before. So it keeps these issues front of mind all the way to resolution. But it also provides a historical perspective. People within organizations change roles, they change jobs, they may go to different organizations and take with them some institutional knowledge about a scenario with a particular vendor that's relevant, where you would want to know about that if you were to re-engage with that vendor in the future, or you have new team members who are onboarding and going to be a part of that relationship, just to have some of that historical knowledge. So really kind of having an issues catalog is helpful in that regard. It's always helpful to review our questionnaires and the tools that you use to evaluate those vendors, again, as you have those changes in the broader regulatory environment, but also within your operational structure and within your market area. Making sure that any changes to documentation standards are carried forward and that all of your documents are consistent through the different areas and aspects. So if you update one, that you carry any appropriate documentation over to others. Remember, these documents are always a starting point. They're never or very seldom intended to be static. They should be updated as your environment changes. And last, I would leave you with making sure, again, that we've engaged others within the organization to fully understand their role. That could be part of onboarding education. It could be part of one-on-ones with managers or departments, having some boots on the ground from your TPRM team out to help explain, see something, say something. Essentially, if they're seeing an issue or a consideration with a vendor, that they are bringing that forward to the committee, to the manager, whomever is the appropriate party, so that it gets on the radar and it gets addressed. It doesn't linger. It's trying to evaluate in those circumstances, is the issue systemic? Is it isolated? Do we need to change our processes, or is it was a one-time thing and we don't have to worry about it going forward? All of those are important considerations and fall really squarely within a TPRM management program to make sure that we're mitigating risk as much as possible within the organization. So we do have some resources for you, as you can see here, that we referred to today as far as some of the surveys and some of the information. And I'm seeing some questions related to the issue log, and we're happy to send some of those out with the follow-up information. But in the meantime, I hope this has been helpful for you all today. We are always excited to come together and be able to present this information on timely topics and how we're assisting our clients, what we're seeing with our clients, because that's one great thing, that we're able to bring that to other clients to say, here's where we see best practices, here's where we see issues, things to be mindful of as you carry out your daily work and mission. So Jennifer, with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you for listening to this PYA webinar recast. The video recording, slides, and associated material for this and all PYA webinars are available on our website. If you have any questions or if we can help, please contact us at pyapc.com. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.